A billionaire CEO promises half his fortune to anyone who can cure his wife, who has been paralyzed for 3 years. In front of renowned doctors, a poor boy from the cleaning crew says he can do the impossible. Humiliated by everyone, he lays his hands on her, and the woman miraculously stands up. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The New York City winter night carried that damp cold that seeps into your bones, but inside the corporate headquarters of Miller Pharma, in the heart of Park Avenue, the atmosphere was warmed by anticipation and ostentatious luxury. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the vast hall on the 32nd floor, where dozens of specialists from every corner of the globe settled into Italian leather armchairs. Waiters circulated discreetly, serving French wines and sophisticated hors d'oeuvres, while an elegant murmur filled the space. Richard Miller watched it all from an improvised stage, his hands gripping the sides of the fine wooden lectern. At 53, he was the personification of American corporate power. Perfectly cut graying hair, a custom-tailored suit from the most expensive shop on Madison Avenue, a solid gold ring on his finger, and a Swiss watch that cost more than an entire apartment in the outer boroughs. His dark eyes scanned the audience with the same intensity he used to analyze financial statements and market strategies. But tonight, Richard Miller wasn't there as a businessman. He was there as a desperate husband. Beside the stage, in a wheelchair lined with imported orthopedic cushions, Beatrice Miller remained motionless. Her 48 years seemed frozen in time since that terrible afternoon 3 years ago when an accident left her paralyzed from the waist down. The navy blue dress she wore was elegant, but it couldn't hide the fragility of a body that no longer responded to its owner's commands. Beatrice kept her gaze fixed on her lap, where her pale hands rested, intertwined, as if held there by an invisible weight. Richard took a deep breath before he began to speak. His voice, always firm in shareholder meetings and billion-dollar negotiations, trembled slightly with the first few words. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here. I know you've traveled long distances and left important commitments to be here tonight. What brought you to New York is not a product launch, nor is it a typical medical conference. It's something much more personal, much more urgent." He paused, and all eyes turned to Beatrice. The woman didn't lift her head. 3 years ago, my wife was in an accident. The details don't matter now. What matters is that since then, she has been confined to this chair. We've consulted the best specialists in the United States, in Europe, all over the world. We've tried experimental treatments, innovative therapies, and invested fortunes in research, and nothing has worked. Richard's voice gained an almost aggressive firmness. So today, I make a promise before all of you, qualified witnesses of international science. Whoever can make my wife walk again will receive half of everything I own, half of my personal fortune. I'm not talking about symbolic awards or future contracts. I'm talking about billions of dollars transferred immediately. A whisper rippled through the audience. Some exchanged surprised glances. Others wore masks of poorly concealed ambition. Richard continued, "You have at your disposal the entire infrastructure of this company, all our technological resources, all the necessary contacts. There is no budget limit. There are no ethical restrictions. I'm not willing to bend. I want results." And then he stepped down from the stage, his footsteps echoing firmly against the marble, and walked over to Beatrice's chair. He placed a hand on her shoulder with a gentleness that seemed almost rehearsed, theatrical. The woman finally raised her eyes, and for a fleeting instant something strange crossed her gaze. It wasn't gratitude. Perhaps it was fear, or maybe suspicion. But Richard had already moved away, greeting the first specialists who approached with proposals and theories. The hall quickly transformed into a spectacle of inflated egos and grandiose promises. A German neurosurgeon with an unpronounceable last name and an impeccable resume spoke of revolutionary spinal stimulation techniques. A Japanese researcher specializing in stem cells guaranteed she could regenerate the damaged nerve tissues in a matter of months. A group of American scientists presented holographic slides on nanotechnology applied to neural rehabilitation. And in the farthest corner of the room, A trio dressed in flowing robes covered in mystical symbols insisted that the true cure would come through cosmic energies and spiritual alignment. Beatrice watched it all with a vacant expression. She had been through so many empty promises, so many painful and useless treatments that this night seemed like just another chapter in the same story of frustration. While the specialists vied for Richard's attention, presenting their credentials as if at an auction of vanities, someone very different was observing the scene from an angle no one was paying attention to. Leo was only 11, but his brown eyes held a depth that belied his young age. Thin, with sun-kissed skin, messy hair, and simple clothes that had been washed so many times they were faded, he held a mop with both hands while pretending to clean the floor of the hallway adjacent to the hall. In reality, he was listening to every word spoken inside. Leo was part of the building's outsourced cleaning crew, or rather, an unofficial helper. His grandmother, Maria, had worked there for 15 years, always on the night shift, always quiet and efficient. But in recent months, her health had deteriorated so much that Leo had to take over some of her tasks so she wouldn't lose her job. No one in management officially knew an 11-year-old boy was there, and Leo preferred it that way. He was invisible. He could watch everything without being noticed. But tonight, something inside him couldn't stay quiet. He saw Beatrice Miller there, surrounded by all those people speaking in complicated terms and making impossible promises, and he felt a strange ache in his chest. It wasn't pity. It was something else, an inexplicable certainty that he could help. Leo didn't fully understand what happened when that feeling took over. It had happened before, always with animals or plants. Once, when he was younger, he touched a baby bird that had fallen from its nest and seemed dead. The little creature opened its eyes and flew away. Another time his grandmother's withered plant on the fire escape, which was completely dry, began to sprout again after he held the pot in his hands. His grandmother always said it was a divine gift, that the boy had been blessed, but Leo didn't like to think about it too much. He just knew that sometimes when he touched something or someone that was suffering, something changed. And now, looking at that woman in the wheelchair, he felt the same tingling in the palms of his hands. He leaned the mop against the wall, and before he could think better of it, walked toward the entrance of the hall. "What do you think you're doing, kid?" The voice came from a large, scowling security guard who immediately blocked the way with his body. Leo swallowed hard. "I just want to talk to Mr. Miller. I can help the lady." The guard let out a short, dry laugh. "You can help? Hey everyone, we've got a little doctor here. Get back to your post, kid. This is no place for you." "But I know I can help. Please, just let me try." "Get lost before I call your supervisor, and you and your grandma both lose your jobs." Leo's heart sank. He knew he couldn't risk Maria's livelihood, but he couldn't just walk away either. So he did something impulsive. He shouted, "Mr. Miller, I can make your wife walk again." The entire hall fell silent. All conversations stopped, heads turned, and Richard Miller, who was talking to the German neurosurgeon, frowned and looked in the direction of the voice. "Who's shouting?" The guard grabbed Leo's arm tightly. "Sorry, Mr. Miller. It's just a kid from the cleaning crew. I'll get him out of here." "Wait." Richard walked to the entrance of the hall, his steps firm, his expression confused. When he saw Leo, his confusion turned to irritation. "What is this? Who let a child in here?" "I work here, sir. Well, I help my grandma. She's sick, and I came in for her." Richard rolled his eyes, but before he could dismiss the boy, Leo continued quickly and desperately. "I know you don't believe me. I know I don't have a degree. I'm not a doctor. I'm nothing. But I can make your wife walk again, I swear. Just let me try." One of the American scientists let out a loud laugh. This ridiculous. A child with a messiah complex." Another specialist, a bald, arrogant man, crossed his arms. "Mr. Miller, frankly, this is disrespectful to our time and expertise. Get this kid out of here." But Richard stood still, studying Leo with a piercing gaze. It wasn't compassion. It was morbid curiosity, perhaps even a hint of cruelty. He knew that allowing this would humiliate the boy in front of everyone, but he also knew it would be good entertainment to break the event's pompous tension. "All right, let the boy try. A murmur of surprise swept through the audience. "Richard, you can't—" "Be serious," came Beatrice's voice the first time she had spoken all night. There was something protective in her tone, as if she wanted to spare the boy from the impending humiliation. "I am. After all, I made a promise. Anyone who can make you walk gets the reward. I didn't specify age, degrees, or methods, so let's see what this boy can do." He made a grand theatrical gesture, pointing to Beatrice. "Go ahead, kid. Show us your miracle." Leo felt dozens of eyes on him. Some were scornful, others pitiful, some openly hostile. But he ignored them all and walked slowly to the wheelchair. Beatrice looked at him, her eyes filling with unshed tears. She knew what was about to happen. The boy would try something, fail, and be torn apart by everyone there. But there was something about this boy, in the seriousness with which he approached, that made her stay silent. Leo knelt in front of her. His hands were trembling, but he extended them and gently placed his palms on Beatrice's paralyzed legs, over the fabric of her dress. "Please, trust me, ma'am." Beatrice didn't answer. She just closed her eyes. And then, something happened. First it was a warmth, an intense heat that began to spread through Beatrice's legs up her spine, filling every fiber of the body that had been numb for 3 years. She gasped in surprise. Then, a strange, almost electric sensation ran through her muscles, and for the first time since the accident she felt her own legs. Her eyes flew open. "I can feel it. Oh my God, I can feel my legs." Leo kept his hands in place, his eyes closed, his breathing deep. He seemed to be in a trance, completely focused. And then, as if an invisible force had been unleashed, the muscles in Beatrice's legs began to contract. They weren't involuntary spasms, they were movements, real movements. A cry of disbelief echoed through the hall. "That's not possible." Beatrice, still in shock, tried to move her toes, and they moved. She tried to bend her knee, and it bent. Tears were now streaming freely down her face. Leo opened his eyes and pulled back, his hands shaking. He looked exhausted, as if he had just run a marathon. "Try to stand up, Mom. I think you can do it." Beatrice looked at Richard, who was completely frozen, his mouth agape. She looked at the specialists who were watching the scene in absolute shock. And then, slowly, she placed her hands on the armrests of the wheelchair and began to push herself up. She wavered for a second, her legs trembling under her own weight after so long without use. But then she found her balance, and she was standing, after 3 years trapped in a chair. I'm standing." She took a step, then another, wobbly, unsure, but walking. The hall erupted into chaos. Some of the guests began to cry openly, overcome with emotion. Others shouted that it was impossible, that it had to be a fraud, that someone had drugged the woman or manipulated the situation somehow. The German neurosurgeon stormed out of the hall, slamming the door, his face red with anger at having his science discredited in front of everyone. The stem cell researcher stood frozen in place, in shock, her hands trembling. The mystical group began to chant, proclaiming they had witnessed a real divine miracle. And in the midst of all that chaos, Richard Miller remained motionless. He showed no joy. He didn't run to hug the wife who had just stood up for the first time in years. He didn't thank the boy who had just done the impossible. Instead, he felt fear, a deep, visceral fear that took hold of every cell in his body, because Richard knew this would change everything, and he was not prepared for the consequences. Beatrice approached him, her step still unsteady but her intention firm. She looked him in the eye, and for the first time in a long time, Richard saw something in her that he hadn't seen in years: strength, autonomy, life. "Thank you," she said, but she wasn't talking to him. She turned to Leo, who was still kneeling on the floor, exhausted. "Thank you so much." The boy just nodded, too weak to speak. And in that instant, as the specialists left the hall in a mixture of outrage and astonishment, as the security guards tried to control the chaos, as Beatrice rediscovered the sensation of standing, Richard Miller made a decision. He couldn't let this get out. He couldn't allow the story of this boy to spread. Because if the world found out that a poor, uneducated, resourceless child without science had done what billions of dollars in research could not, everything he had built would crumble. His reputation, his company, his power, everything. And Richard Miller was not willing to lose any of it. So, while everyone was still distracted, he took out his phone and dialed a number he only used in emergencies, a number that connected directly to someone capable of solving problems the law couldn't touch. "Hello, Patricia. I need your services. Now. And this time it's big. Very big." The voice on the other end of the line was cold and efficient. "I'm listening. I need you to destroy someone completely. I want this person to become a joke, a laughingstock, a nobody. Can you do that?" "Depends. Who's the target?" Richard looked at Leo, who was now being helped to his feet by one of the waiters. The boy looked so innocent, so oblivious to the danger he was about to face. An 11-year-old boy. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a low, sinister laugh. "Interesting. Send me the details. I'll get started tonight." Richard hung up the phone and put it in his pocket. He took a deep breath, composed his expression, and returned to the center of the hall, where Beatrice was now walking in small circles, still getting used to her newfound freedom. He smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And he began to plan how he would destroy the boy who had just saved his wife. Patricia Mendoza wasn't the kind of person who appeared in magazines or on TV shows. Her work depended on the exact opposite, staying in the shadows, being a name few knew, but all the powerful knew where to find when they needed problems solved that couldn't be handled through conventional means. She was 42, with a discreet appearance that went completely unnoticed anywhere, and a mind as sharp as a scalpel for understanding human weaknesses and exploiting them to their limit. Her office was in a nondescript commercial building in Midtown Manhattan, with a sign on the door that simply read Strategic Communications Consulting, but the services she offered went far beyond simple public relations. Patricia was a specialist in destroying reputations. When the phone rang that winter night, she was already working on another case, helping a politician cover up a public funds embezzlement scandal through a meticulously planned campaign of media distraction and witness discreditation. But when she saw Richard Miller's name on her phone screen, she dropped everything immediately. Richard was a long-time client, paid very well, and never asked for anything small. The conversation was brief and to the point. Richard explained the situation in a few words, without getting into emotional details or moral justifications. An 11-year-old boy had done something impossible in front of dozens of important witnesses, and it couldn't become a positive news story. It needed to be buried, ridiculed, turned into a joke before it gained traction. As an inspiring tale, Patricia listened in silence, making mental notes, and by the time Richard finished speaking, she already had a complete plan formed in her head. "Interesting," was all she said before hanging up, and then she got to work. The first thing Patricia did was assemble her team, 3 people of absolute trust, each an expert in a specific area of digital and media manipulation. Chris was the hacker, capable of creating fake social media profiles that looked completely real and planting information in forums and obscure websites that would eventually be discovered by journalists looking for a scoop. Amanda was the content producer, responsible for creating videos, memes, and texts that spread like wildfire across social media. And Fernando was the networker, the man who knew journalists, influencers, bloggers, and internet personalities willing to promote anything for the right price. They met in the early hours of the morning in a windowless room in Patricia's office, with only the blue glow of computer screens illuminating their focused faces. Patricia distributed the tasks with the precision of a general planning a battle. "By the end of tomorrow, I want this kid to be a national joke. There can't be a shred of his credibility left. We'll start by planting doubt, then we'll move to a direct attack." "Understood." They all nodded. Chris began by creating fake social media profiles, dozens of them, each with fabricated backstories, photos stolen from real people, and seemingly legitimate connections. Some posed as doctors who were at the event and claimed to have seen the boy drug the woman before the supposed cure. Others were profiles of residents from the community where Leo lived, inventing stories about the boy being involved with charlatans and false prophets who scammed desperate people. The posts began to appear sporadically, calculatedly, as if they were spontaneous accounts from outraged individuals. Amanda, in turn, created cleverly edited videos. She took footage from the event, which had been discreetly filmed by guests, and assembled a narrative completely different from reality. In one video, she added a voiceover, suggesting the whole thing was a theatrical performance hired by Richard Miller himself to get publicity for his company. In another, she used slow motion and zoom effects to make it look like Leo was using some kind of hidden device in his hands. The videos were professional enough to seem credible, but amateurish enough to look like they were made by ordinary citizens concerned with the truth. Fernando activated his contacts. He called 3 journalists from sensationalist news portals who he knew would publish anything for the right money and the promise of clicks. He sent messages to digital influencers with millions of followers, offering generous sums for them to make videos mocking the story of the miracle boy. And he planted the seed in conspiracy theory podcasts, where hosts always hungry for controversial content would embrace the narrative with enthusiasm. In less than 24 hours, the destruction machine was running at full steam. The first articles began to appear the next morning. Truth Now News published a report with the headline, "Charlatan Kid Scams Millionaire Businessman with Magic Trick." The text was filled with anonymous statements from supposed witnesses who claimed to have seen Leo rehearsing the stunt days before. None of the sources actually existed, but the portal had learned long ago that fact-checking was optional when a story generated a lot of traffic. By 10 a.m., 3 different influencers had already posted videos about the case. One of them, a comedian with 5 million followers, did a satirical sketch where a boy in tattered clothes pretended to heal people while asking for money. The video got 500,000 views in the first 2 hours. By noon, the story was trending on X. People were divided between those who believed it was a real miracle and those who were sure it was a fraud. But the volume of fake accounts created by Chris was so large that the fraud narrative completely dominated the conversation. Memes began to circulate. Cruel jokes about the boy became common currency. And Leo's name, which until then was completely unknown, became synonymous with child con artist. While all this was happening in the virtual world, Leo was at home completely oblivious to the storm gathering around him. The apartment he shared with Maria was in a narrow alley in a low-income neighborhood in the South Bronx, far from the skyscrapers and luxury of Park Avenue. It was a simple 2-room structure, with exposed brick walls that had never been plastered, a tin roof that got too hot in the summer and didn't insulate the cold in the winter, and an uneven concrete floor that Maria swept 3 times a day to keep clean. There was no internet at home, no cable TV, not even a modern cell phone. The only connection to the outside world was an old radio that played country music and local news. Leo was sitting on the edge of the bed where his grandmother rested, holding her hand in his. Maria had gotten much worse in the last few days. The cough that was once occasional was now constant, scraping deep in her chest as if something were scratching from the inside. She was losing weight every week, her face growing more gaunt, her eyes sunken and tired. Leo knew she was very sick, even though his grandmother insisted it was just a bad cold that would soon pass. He wasn't stupid. He saw the blood staining the handkerchief when she coughed. He saw the pain she tried to hide when she moved. He knew it was something serious. "Grandma, you need to see a doctor, please. I can borrow some money from someone. We can pay for the bus to the free clinic." Maria smiled, a tired but loving expression. Her wrinkled, cold hand squeezed her grandson's fingers with what little strength she had left. "No need, my boy, it'll pass. God will take care of Grandma, don't you worry. And you too, right, my blessed boy?" Leo's eyes burned, but he didn't cry. Boys don't cry, that's what the kids on the street always said. Even at 11, he had already learned to swallow his tears and pretend everything was okay. "I tried to help that lady yesterday, Grandma, the one in the wheelchair. I put my hands on her legs and she got up. She walked again. It was just like that time with the bird." Maria's smile widened, her eyes shining with deep pride. "I know, my angel. I know you have a special gift. God chose you to be his instrument. But listen carefully to what Grandma is about to tell you. She pulled her grandson closer, her voice growing more serious. The world isn't kind to those who are different, Leo. People are afraid of what they don't understand, and when they're afraid, they get angry. You need to be careful, you hear me? Don't go around telling everyone what you can do. Keep it to yourself for when it's really necessary. I know, Grandma, I just wanted to help. And you did, my son, I'm sure of it. But now come here, lie down next to me and tell me all about last night. I want to know everything. Leo lay down next to his grandmother on the old bed that creaked with every movement and began to recount every detail of the previous night. He talked about the luxurious hall, the important scientists, the way everyone looked at him with contempt until he touched the woman's legs. He talked about the strange sensation he felt, as if a warm energy passed through the palms of his hands and into her body. He talked about how the woman stood up and walked, and how some people cried with emotion while others shouted that it was a lie. Maria listened intently, asking questions here and there, smiling at the beautiful moments and frowning at the tense ones. When Leo finished, she was silent for a long time, just staring at the ceiling with that thoughtful expression Leo knew so well. "This Richard Miller," she finally continued, "did he thank you? Did he treat you well?" Leo hesitated. "Not really, Grandma. He got kind of weird, like he was scared of me." Maria sighed deeply. "That's because he is scared, my son. Very rich people are often afraid of losing what they have. And you, without meaning to, showed that there's something in the world his money can't buy. That scares people like him." Leo didn't fully understand what his grandmother meant, but he stored her words in his memory anyway. He lay there beside her until Maria fell asleep, her difficult, noisy breathing echoing in the silence of the small room. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, inside the Miller mansion in a gated community on the Upper East Side, Beatrice was living the strangest experience of her life. She had woken up that morning able to walk, able to feel her own legs, able to do simple things that were automatic 3 years ago and that she had come to consider impossible miracles. She walked to the bathroom without help for the first time in years. She looked at herself in the mirror, standing, without needing to be carried or pushed in a chair. She showered by herself, feeling the hot water run over her entire body, including the parts that had become a dead, numb zone for so long. She got dressed by herself, without needing to ask for help from the private nurse who had been with her since the accident. She walked down the stairs by herself, stepping on each one with a mixture of fear and euphoria. And when she reached the kitchen, she found the housekeeper preparing breakfast and simply burst into tears. The housekeeper, Rosa, a 60-year-old woman who had worked for the Miller family for over 2 decades, dropped everything and ran to hug Beatrice, crying along with her. "Oh my God, Mrs. B, you're walking. It's a miracle, a real miracle." They stood there hugging for long minutes, 2 women who had shared so much over the years, crying tears of joy and relief. When they finally separated, Beatrice wiped her face with the back of her hand and sat down at the kitchen table, something she hadn't done since the accident. Usually she had breakfast at a special table adapted for the wheelchair, but now she could sit in a normal chair like a normal person. "Where's Richard?" she asked, looking around. Rosa served her coffee with milk and placed a fresh bagel in front of her boss. "Mr. Miller left early, said he had an important meeting at the company, but he left a message that he'd be back for lunch." Beatrice nodded, but something about that information bothered her. Richard hadn't come to bed the night before. After the event, he claimed he needed to sort out some pending issues related to the contracts with the specialists who had attended, and locked himself in the mansion's office. Beatrice, exhausted and still processing everything that had happened, ended up sleeping alone in the adapted room where she had spent the last several hundred nights. But now, in the light of day, she began to think about details she hadn't noticed at the time. Richard hadn't celebrated her recovery. He hadn't hugged her with joy. He hadn't cried with emotion seeing her on her feet. In fact, he had barely looked at her after the boy did what he did. He was distracted, tense, as if it were a problem and not a miracle. Beatrice sipped her coffee slowly, thoughtfully. She had known her husband for 25 years, been married to him for 22, She knew his habits, his silences, his expressions, and she knew when he was hiding something. She decided to run a test. She picked up her cell phone, the same one she used to communicate with friends and family, and opened the browser. She typed her own name into the search bar, curious to see if anyone had reported her miraculous recovery. What she found sent a chill down her spine. The first pages of results were filled with sensationalist articles questioning the authenticity of the event. Aggressive, accusatory headlines jumped off the screen. Videos with millions of views mocking the story. Cruel memes about the boy. And a flood of hateful comments, calling Leo every nasty name in the book. Beatrice's stomach turned. That boy who had done for her what no doctor in the world could was being publicly destroyed. And somehow she knew Richard was involved. She finished her breakfast without an appetite, the bitter taste in her mouth not from the coffee but from the discovery she was making. She went back up to her room, feeling her legs tremble not from physical weakness, but from anger and disappointment. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her own hands, the same hands that had rested motionless in her lap for 3 years. And then, for the first time in a long time, Beatrice allowed herself to question everything about her life, about her marriage, about the accident, about the 3 years she spent trapped in a chair while Richard went on with his life, as if nothing had changed. She had never investigated the details of the accident. It had been so traumatic, so sudden, that she simply accepted the official version, the version Richard had told her. A mechanical failure in the car. Bad luck. Fate. But now, with a clearer mind and her body finally free, she began to wonder if there was more to the story than she had been told. She got up from the bed and walked to the closet, a huge room full of expensive clothes she no longer wore since she became paralyzed. In the back, in a dusty shoebox, she kept old documents, things she had tossed in there in the first few months after the accident and never touched again. Now, she began to rummage through that box with trembling hands. She found old photos, letters, receipts. And then, at the bottom of the box, she found something that made her stop breathing. It was a sealed manila envelope with her name handwritten on it. She didn't remember putting it there. She opened it carefully, her fingers shaking, and pulled out documents. Medical reports from the accident, technical reports on the car, and a handwritten letter signed by someone she didn't know. Beatrice read the letter once, then she read it again, and with each reading, she felt her world crumble a little more. The letter was from a mechanic who had worked on the analysis of the wrecked car. In it, the man said that the mechanical failures were not natural, that there were signs of sabotage, and that he had been pressured to omit this information from the official report. He said he couldn't prove anything, but his conscience wouldn't let him rest, and so he was leaving this letter as a testimony. Beatrice's hands were shaking so much she almost dropped the paper. Her heart was pounding. Her breath came in short, quick gasps. This couldn't be true. It couldn't. But deep down, in a dark and frightening place in her mind, a voice whispered that yes, it could be true, that maybe there was a lot she didn't know about her own husband, about her own life. She put the documents back in the box and pushed it to the back of the closet again. She wasn't ready to deal with that yet. First, she needed to understand what was happening to the boy. Then she would deal with the ghosts of the past. She went downstairs again and found Rosa cleaning the living room. "Rosa, do you have the contact information for the cleaning company that works at the office building?" The housekeeper seemed surprised by the question. "I do, Mrs. B. It's in the house contact book. Why?" "I need to find someone. A person who works there. It's important." Rosa didn't ask any more questions. She got the book, found the number for the third-party company, and gave it to Beatrice. The woman thanked her and went to the Home Office, closed the door and made the call. The conversation was brief. Beatrice identified herself, asked for information about an employee named Maria and a boy named Leo, who sometimes helped her. The receptionist hesitated, citing privacy concerns, but when Beatrice explained that she was the woman who had been helped by the boy and just wanted to thank him personally, the receptionist relented and gave her an address. Beatrice wrote everything down carefully. Then she put on a coat, grabbed her purse, and left the house. She asked the driver to take her to that address. The man, surprised to see her walking, obeyed without question. The drive took almost an hour, crossing New York City from one end to the other, from the wealth of the Upper East Side to the simplicity of the South Bronx. And with every mile, Beatrice felt she was distancing herself, not just geographically, but from everything her life had been until then. When they finally arrived at the address, the driver seemed concerned. "Mrs. Miller, are you sure this is the place? This neighborhood isn't very safe." "I'm sure. You can wait for me. I won't be long." She got out of the car and walked down the narrow alley until she found the exposed brick building with the number she had written down. She took a deep breath and knocked on the old wooden door. Leo opened it. The boy recognized her immediately, his eyes widening in surprise. "Mom?" "Hi, Leo. I came to thank you, and to talk if you'll let me." The boy hesitated for a second, then opened the door completely and invited her in. And it was there, in that simple home that could fit entirely inside the living room of the Miller mansion, that Beatrice began to understand that her life would never be the same again. The apartment was even simpler than Beatrice had imagined when the driver dropped her off in front of that alley. From the outside, it was already clear it was a precarious structure, but inside, the reality of poverty was even more striking. The exposed brick walls were peeling in some spots. Damp stains formed irregular patterns near the ceiling, and the concrete floor had deep cracks that someone had tried to patch with makeshift filler. There were only 2 rooms, separated by a thin, faded fabric curtain that must have once been a cheerful color, but was now just a grayish beige. One room served as both a bedroom and living room, with a narrow bed against the wall, a plastic table with 2 old chairs, and a makeshift shelf of planks and bricks holding a few books, pots and groceries. The other room was a tiny kitchen with a 2-burner stove, a cracked sink and a small wooden cabinet eaten away by termites. Beatrice felt a tightness in her chest as she entered. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper and more painful. It was guilt, shame, a sharp awareness of the brutal inequality that separated her life from this boy's. While she had spent 3 years lamenting in a mansion with 15 bedrooms, a heated pool, a private movie theater, and a team of staff catering to her every whim, this boy with an inexplicable gift and a generous heart lived in conditions most people would consider undignified. Leo led her to one of the old chairs and offered her water in a glass cup that had a small chip on the rim. Beatrice accepted and drank, more to make the boy feel comfortable than out of thirst. Then they sat there facing each other, separated by that plastic table that wobbled because one of its legs was bent. "Thank you for having me, Leo. I know you must be confused by everything that's happening." The boy shrugged, an expression too mature for his age. "You don't have to thank me, Mum. I just did what I felt I had to do. I can't really explain it. But when I saw you there in the chair, I knew I could help. And I had to help." Beatrice felt her eyes well up. That simplicity, that pure, uncalculated kindness, was something she hadn't seen in her social circle for a long time. The people she associated with, including her own husband, were driven by interests, strategies, power games. But this boy just wanted to help. It was as simple as that. "You must have seen the news. The things they're saying about you online. They're saying horrible things, making up lies." Leo looked down, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "We don't have internet here, and I don't watch much TV either. Just listen to the radio sometimes. But this morning, when I went to buy bread at the corner store, the owner looked at me funny. Said I was famous, that people were talking about me on his phone. He showed me some videos. People were laughing at me, calling me a liar, saying I drugged you or that the whole thing was staged." He looked up again, and Beatrice saw unshed tears in his eyes. "I didn't do any of that, ma'am, I swear. I would never hurt anyone. I just wanted to help." "I know, Leo. I know you did nothing wrong. On the contrary, you gave me back something I thought I had lost forever. I don't know how you did it. I don't know what happened when you touched my legs, but it was real. I'm walking. I'm feeling. I'm alive again." She reached across the table and held the boy's small, calloused hand. "And I came here because I need to tell you something. I think all of this that's happening, all these lies, isn't a coincidence. I think someone is behind it, someone powerful who has an interest in destroying your reputation before your story becomes something inspiring." Leo frowned, confused. But why? Who would want to do that? Beatrice hesitated. To say out loud what she was thinking would be to admit something terrible about her own husband. But she had to be honest, at least with this boy who had been so honest with her. I think it might be my husband, Richard Miller. He's a very rich and powerful man, and he's afraid of anything that might shake his position. When you healed me in front of all those specialists, you proved that there's something in the world his money and science can't control, and that scared him. It scared him a lot. But he should have been happy. You're his wife. He should have wanted you to be well. Beatrice smiled sadly. I thought so too, Leo. I thought that for 3 years. But now I'm starting to realize that maybe I don't know my husband as well as I thought I did. At that moment, they heard a hoarse cough from the other room behind the curtain. Leo stood up immediately, his face filled with concern. That's my grandma. She's very sick. Excuse me, ma'am. He disappeared behind the curtain, and Beatrice heard low voices talking. After a few minutes, Leo returned with an even heavier expression. Would you like to meet my grandma? She's the one who raised me after my parents died in an accident when I was a baby. She's the most important person in the world to me. Beatrice nodded and followed the boy. On the other side of the curtain, in a bed that took up almost all the available space, lay a very thin and visibly frail old woman. Maria must have been in her 70s, but she looked much older. Her white hair was loose on the old pillow, her face was pale and sweaty, her eyes sunken but still bright with a spark of life. She smiled when she saw Beatrice, a weak but genuine smile. So you're the woman my grandson helped. What a blessing to meet you. I'm sorry I can't get up to greet you properly. Beatrice approached the bed and, without second thought, held the old woman's cold, trembling hand. Please don't worry about that. It's an honor to meet you, Maria. Your grandson is an extraordinary person. You must be very proud of him. I am. He's my treasure, my golden boy. Maria let out a long, painful cough, her whole body contracting with the effort. When the cough passed, she wiped her mouth with a handkerchief that already had several dark bloodstains. Beatrice's heart ached. Are you receiving treatment? Are you being seen by a doctor? Maria gave a faint chuckle. Doctors are expensive, my dear. We've been on the waiting list at the free clinic for months, but they never call. And I can't afford a private one. It is what it is. God knows what he's doing. Beatrice looked at Leo, who was standing by the bed with his eyes shining with unshed tears, and made an immediate decision. Maria, I'm going to arrange for a private doctor for you, the best I can find, and I'll pay for all the tests, all the necessary treatments. It's the least I can do after what your grandson did for me. Leo and Maria looked at each other surprised. No, ma'am, we can't accept that. It's too much charity. It's not charity, it's gratitude, and I won't take no for an answer. I'll be back tomorrow with a doctor. Leave everything to me. Beatrice spent another hour talking with them. Maria, despite her weakness, was a natural storyteller. She talked about how she raised Leo alone after his parents were gone, about the years working as a cleaner in office buildings to support them both, about the little miracles her grandson had performed since he was a child. She spoke with so much love and pride that Beatrice felt a pang of envy. She had no children, never had, and now at 48 and finally able to walk again, she began to wonder if there was still time to build something like the relationship she saw there. When she left the apartment and got back in the car, the driver asked where they should go. Beatrice looked out the window, seeing the simple life of the community around her, so different and so distant from the world she lived in, and answered firmly, home. But first, stop at a pharmacy. I'm going to buy some medicine. She stopped at the pharmacy, bought a bag full of medicine for colds, pain and fever, and asked the driver to go back to Leo's apartment to drop it off. Then, finally, they went to the mansion on the Upper East Side. When she got home, it was almost lunchtime. Richard was already there, sitting at the table on the terrace, scrolling through his phone with a focused expression. When he saw Beatrice arrive, he quickly put his phone away and smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "B, where were you? I got home and you weren't here. Rosa said you went out without saying where." Beatrice sat down at the table, analyzing every detail of her husband's expression. That face she knew so well, those eyes that had once made her feel loved, now seemed like the eyes of a stranger. I went to pay a visit, to meet the family of the boy who helped me yesterday. Richard's expression changed subtly. His jaw tensed, his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, but he kept his tone casual. The boy? The one from the cleaning crew? Why did you go there? Because I wanted to thank him. He did for me what no one could do in 3 years, Richard. He deserves at least a thank you. And I found out his grandmother is very sick. I'm going to arrange for doctors and treatment for her. Richard put his fork down on the table with more force than necessary. Beatrice, you can't go around making promises like that. You don't know these people. It could be a scam. It could be people trying to take advantage of your gratitude. Or it could be genuinely good people who need help. How do you explain what happened to me yesterday, Richard? How do you explain that I'm walking? That I can feel my legs again after 3 years? I don't know. It could have been a spontaneous remission. It could have been a psychological effect. It could have been a coincidence. It doesn't mean the boy has some special power. Beatrice leaned forward, her voice growing colder. Then why are people spreading lies about him on the internet? Why are there videos, articles, posts saying it was all a fraud? Who would care so much about destroying an 11-year-old boy? Richard picked up his phone again, pretending to look at something important. I don't. No, B. The world is full of malicious people. There's always someone trying to stir up trouble. But you're not stirring up anything, are you, Richard? You wouldn't hire someone to do that, would you? The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Richard didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation said more than 1,000 words. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and defensive. I don't know what you're talking about, and I think you should stop making baseless accusations. Beatrice stood up from the table, her legs trembling not from weakness, but from suppressed rage. You? No, Richard, for 3 years I was stuck in that wheelchair, completely dependent on you, the nurses, the staff, and during all that time, you were a present husband, caring, attentive, or at least that's what I thought. But now that I can walk again, now that I have my autonomy back, I'm starting to see things I didn't see before, or didn't want to see. She started to walk away, but Richard called out, Beatrice, wait. Come here. Let's talk properly. But she didn't turn back. She went up the stairs, each step firm and determined, and went straight to the closet. She took the dusty shoebox from the back, pulled out the manila envelope with the documents about the accident, and came back down. Richard was still on the terrace, now standing, clearly uncomfortable. Beatrice threw the envelope on the table, the papers scattering. What is this? He picked up the documents and began to read. Beatrice watched his face go pale as he understood what was there. Where did you get this? It doesn't matter where I got it. What matters is if it's true. Did you have Mark bribe a mechanic to sabotage my car? Did you try to kill me, Richard? The silence that followed was the confirmation Beatrice didn't want but expected. Richard dropped the papers on the table and ran his hands over his face, a gesture of extreme exhaustion. It wasn't to kill you. The intention was never to kill you. It was just supposed to be a small accident, a scare, something to keep you at home for a while. Beatrice felt her legs give way and had to lean on the chair beside her. A small accident? Richard, I was paralyzed for 3 years. 3 years without being able to walk, without being able to feel my own legs. And you're telling me it wasn't supposed to be like that? I didn't know it would be so bad. The idiot mechanic overdid it, did something wrong. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. And why, Richard? Why did you do it? Richard got up from his chair and walked to the office window. He stood there, his back to her, looking out at the mansion's immense garden. Because you were finding things out you shouldn't have. You were asking questions, investigating the company's financial movements. You were always too smart. Beatrice always paid attention to everything. And you were starting to find out about the irregularities, about the embezzled money, about the schemes. What schemes? Over-invoicing for medications, sabotaging research that could create cheap and effective drugs, illegal deals with suppliers, bribing FDA officials. Everything I did to build this empire, Beatrice, everything I had to do to give us this life of luxury, this mansion, these trips, everything. Beatrice felt nausea rise in her throat. And you thought putting me in a wheelchair would solve the problem, that I would stop being a threat if I were paralyzed. It worked for 3 years, didn't it? You became so focused on your own recovery, so dependent, so vulnerable, that you stopped paying attention to everything else, and I could continue running the business without worry. Beatrice started to laugh, a bitter, humorless laugh. You're a monster, a real monster, and I was a fool not to have seen it sooner. Richard turned to her, and for the first time, Beatrice saw something like remorse in his eyes. I never wanted to really hurt you, Bea. I loved you, I really did. In the beginning, at least, but the business, the money, the power, it all took over. And at some point, I don't know when, you just became another obstacle I had to get around. And Helen? Where does she fit into all this? Richard's expression changed. It became defensive, almost ashamed. What about Helen? Don't treat me like an idiot, Richard. I know there's something between you two. I know you've been seeing my sister. I have proof. Photos. Messages. Richard closed his eyes, defeated. It started 5 years ago. She came asking for financial help. She was in debt. I helped her, and one thing led to another. It was never serious, Beatrice. It was just physical. It didn't mean anything. It didn't mean anything. You cheated on your wife with her sister, and you say it didn't mean anything. And did she know? Did Helen know about the accident? About what you did? Richard didn't answer, but the silence was answer enough. Oh my God, she knew. My own sister knew you tried to kill me and said nothing. She kept seeing you, kept betraying me, knowing everything. Beatrice had to sit down. The weight of all these revelations was crushing. Discovering her husband had tried to kill her was devastating enough. Discovering her own sister was involved with him and knew everything was beyond what she could process. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in Patricia Mendoza's discreet office, another meeting was taking place. Patricia had urgently summoned Richard, saying there were new and worrying developments in the case. When Richard arrived, he found Patricia with a grave expression. We have a problem, a serious problem. Someone is investigating your wife's accident, a private detective, and he found the mechanic. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. How do you know that? Because I have contacts everywhere, Richard. That's what you pay me for. And I've learned that the mechanic has already given a full statement to the detective, recorded, everything. Richard sat down heavily in the chair, his face pale. What do I do? You have 2 options. Either you confess everything before you're exposed, control the narrative, try to minimize the damage, or you deny everything, say it's a setup, and use all your power and money to destroy the credibility of the mechanic and the detective. And which do you recommend? Patricia was silent for a long moment, studying Richard with her cold, calculating eyes. I recommend you face the consequences of your actions, because I don't work for you anymore. Not after finding out you tried to kill your own wife. I may be a lot of things, Richard, but I have my limits, and you just crossed all of them. Richard tried to argue, tried to offer more money, tried to threaten, but Patricia was adamant. She had unilaterally terminated the contract, and more than that, she had given a contact she had at a major investigative newspaper all the information she had about the smear campaign against Leo, including proof that Richard had hired her specifically to destroy an 11-year-old boy. The next day, the newspaper published a devastating report. The headline read, Richard Miller ordered smear campaign against child who healed his wife. The article had all the details, the exchanged messages, the payments, the fake profiles created, the edited videos, everything. And at the end, there was also the testimony of the mechanic, Joe, about the sabotage of Beatrice's car. The story exploded like a nuclear bomb. Within hours, it was on every news portal, every TV show, every social media platform. The entire country stopped to follow the scandal. Richard Miller, the powerful pharmaceutical tycoon, had tried to kill his own wife and then ordered the destruction of the reputation of an innocent child who had healed her. Miller Pharma's stock plummeted. Shareholders demanded explanations. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Authorities opened criminal investigations, and public opinion, which had mercilessly attacked Leo, now turned with the same fury against Richard. Leo, still grieving and lost after the loss of his grandmother, woke up to dozens of apologetic messages. People who had mocked him now begged for forgiveness. Influencers who had made cruel videos deleted everything and posted retractions. News portals published articles acknowledging their mistake and apologizing for the misinformation. But for Leo, it was all too late. Maria was gone, and no apology in the world could bring her back. Beatrice, shaken by everything she had discovered, but at the same time strengthened by finally knowing the truth, took decisive action. She hired the best criminal defense attorney in New York, a man named Dr. Henry Travers, known for his unwavering integrity and for never having lost a case he took on because he genuinely believed in the cause. She presented all the evidence against Richard and demanded he be brought to justice. Dr. Travers analyzed everything meticulously and confirmed there was enough material not only for a criminal case against Richard for attempted murder, but also for charges related to corporate crimes, corruption, and a host of other irregularities. That same day, Beatrice went to Helen's simple apartment downtown. She didn't call first. She didn't give a warning. She simply rang the doorbell, and when her sister opened the door, she walked in without asking permission. Helen was in a bathrobe, her hair disheveled, clearly not expecting visitors. When she saw Beatrice, her face turned white. No. Beatrice cut her off. You're not going to say anything. Now you're going to listen to me. The two stood there in the small, messy living room, and Beatrice said everything she needed to say. She spoke of the betrayal, of the secret Helen kept, of her complicity in Richard's crime. She spoke of the years of unresolved envy Helen had always harbored, of the sick pleasure she felt seeing her older sister suffer. She spoke of how, despite everything, she was still her sister, and, for that reason, she was giving her one chance, one single opportunity to do the right thing. You're going to testify against him. You're going to tell them everything you know, and you're going to take your share of the responsibility in all this, or I will make sure you are prosecuted as an accomplice to attempted murder. You choose. Helen, who had never seen her sister so firm, so determined, so strong, broke down. She cried desperately, begged for forgiveness repeatedly, and promised she would do anything to fix the damage. And Beatrice, despite her anger and pain, felt a flicker of compassion, because she saw a woman destroyed by her own envy, someone who had wasted years of her life on resentment and bitterness instead of building something of her own. In the following months, the legal proceedings against Richard moved quickly. Dr. Travers built a solid, irrefutable case. Helen testified, confirming everything. The mechanic, Joe, testified, providing technical details of the sabotage. Miller Pharma employees, who had been silenced for years, finally found the courage to speak about the irregularities they knew of. And Richard, cornered on all sides, without allies, without an escape, finally confessed everything. In a public hearing that was broadcast live across the country. It was a surreal moment to see that powerful man, who had always had control over everything and everyone, sitting in the defendant's chair, his voice trembling, admitting that he had tried to kill his own wife for fear of losing power and money, admitting that he had used all his power to destroy an innocent boy, admitting to decades of corporate crimes, corruption, and manipulation. The sentence was severe. Richard was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder, plus additional sentences for corporate crimes. He lost all control over Miller Pharma. Most of his assets were seized and used to pay damages and fines, and perhaps worst of all for someone like him, he completely lost his reputation. The man who was once on magazine covers as an example of a successful entrepreneur became a synonym for corruption and cruelty. Dr. Travers, impressed by the whole story and moved by a deep sense of justice, proposed something unexpected. With the support of other honest shareholders in the company, he orchestrated a complete restructuring of Miller Pharma. Richard was replaced by a new board, committed to transparency and ethics, and Dr. Travers took over as chairman of the board with a clear mission to transform the company into what it should have always been, an organization focused on saving lives, not profiting from illness. Beatrice, finally free from the toxic marriage and the lies that surrounded her, made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She took the fortune she had left from the divorce, a substantial amount even after all the damages and seizures, and decided to use it to build something meaningful. Together with Leo, now officially under her legal guardianship, she founded a community hospital in the neighborhood where the boy grew up. It wasn't an ordinary hospital. It was a place that combined modern medicine with human compassion, where people who couldn't afford private treatment could receive quality care, where volunteer doctors worked not for fame or money, but for the genuine purpose of helping. Leo, now a teenager, helped at the hospital whenever he could. He no longer performed his inexplicable healings. That gift, or whatever it was, seemed to have disappeared after Maria's death, as if it had fulfilled its purpose and could now rest. But Leo no longer needed that power to make a difference. He made a difference every day simply by being who he was, talking to patients, bringing comfort to those who suffered, spreading smiles and hope. Years passed. The hospital grew, became a model, and inspired similar projects in several cities across the country. Beatrice, who had discovered a calling she never knew she had, dedicated herself completely to managing the project. And slowly, she healed from the emotional wounds Richard had left. She met new people, made genuine friendships, and eventually even allowed herself to consider the possibility of a new love. Not in a hurry, not out of desperation, but with the wisdom of someone who learned that time heals even the deepest wounds. Helen, for her part, served a reduced sentence for cooperating with the justice system, but she carried the weight of what she had done forever. When she got out, she tried to reconnect with her sister. Beatrice received her, but made it clear that trust would have to be rebuilt brick by brick. And Helen accepted that. She started volunteering at the hospital, doing simple tasks, trying in some way to make up for years of envy and malice. It would be a long road, but for the first time in her life, Helen was genuinely trying to be a better person. Dr. Travers transformed Miller Pharma into one of the most ethical pharmaceutical companies in the country. He invested heavily in research for affordable medicines, opened free distribution programs for low-income populations, and became a benchmark for how profit and social responsibility can go hand in hand. And he always credited Beatrice and Leo as the inspiration for this transformation. Richard served his sentence in silence. In prison, without power, without money, without influence, he finally had to face who he really was. And it was painful, it was devastating, but it was also necessary. He started therapy, participated in reflection groups, and slowly, very slowly, began to understand the extent of the harm he had caused. He never fully forgave himself, but he learned to live with the weight of his choices. When he was finally released after serving his sentence, Richard was a completely different man, older, more tired, but in a way, more human. He sought out Beatrice, not to ask for forgiveness or to try to win back something he should never have lost, but simply to say that she was right, that she had always been right, and that he had wasted the chance to have a real life with an extraordinary woman by getting lost in greed and power. Beatrice received him politely, but without affection. Forgiveness, she said, was not something she could give. But she could offer indifference, and indifference, she discovered, was a form of liberation. Richard accepted that as all he deserved and left. He got a humble job in a small company, far from the spotlight, and lived the rest of his days trying to be a better man, knowing he could never undo the past, but could at least not repeat the same mistakes. And Leo? Leo grew up. He became a young man in his 20s, graduated from medical school with a full scholarship from a state university, and returned to work at the same hospital he and Beatrice had founded. He chose to specialize in palliative care, looking after people in their final moments of life, bringing comfort and dignity where a physical cure was no longer possible. Because he had learned from Maria and then from everything he had lived through that sometimes the greatest healing isn't making the body work again, but making a person feel loved and at peace. And one day, decades after everything had happened, when Leo was a respected doctor and Beatrice a white-haired lady who remained active in the hospital's management, an unexpected discovery came to light. Old documents forgotten in dusty courthouse archives revealed something surprising. Leo was not just any orphan. He was the son of a man who, decades earlier, had been an heir to the Richard Miller family. A distant uncle who had renounced all his inheritance and fortune to marry a simple woman. For love. This man and his wife, Leo's parents, had lived humbly and happily until the accident that took them when Leo was still a baby. The revelation shook the Miller family. It meant that Leo technically had a right to a part of the original inheritance. But when lawyers approached him to inform him of this, Leo refused it all. He said his father had made the right choice in choosing love over money, and that he would follow the same path. His only wealth, he said, was the purpose he had found in serving others, and that was a wealth no amount of money could buy. The story of Leo and Beatrice became a legend, an example, an inspiration for thousands of people who found themselves lost in their own lives. And the hospital they created together continued to grow, spreading not just medical treatment, but something much more precious: hope. Because in the end, after all the betrayal, all the pain, all the suffering, what prevailed was not Richard's evil or Helen's envy. What prevailed was Leo's kindness, Beatrice's strength, and the lesson that every journey, no matter how painful, exists to take us somewhere better. And that sometimes miracles don't happen to save us from our problems, but to give us enough strength to get through them and emerge transformed on the other side. Years later, when Beatrice was a respected old woman with completely white hair and Leo a mature doctor with his own children, they would still sometimes sit together on the hospital's porch, looking out at the community around them that had changed so much since that first day. And they would remember everything, the pain, the losses, the victories, and they agreed it was all worth it. Every painful second was worth it, because it led them exactly where they needed to be. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Leo and Beatrice has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of pain, betrayal, discovery, and transformation, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what stood out to you the most. Was it Leo's courage in the midst of suffering? Beatrice's strength upon discovering the whole truth? The possibility of redemption even after the gravest mistakes? Every day we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, showing how kindness can prevail even in the darkest moments, and how each of us has the power to choose to be a light in the midst of shadows. We'll see you in the next episode, with another story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on life, love, justice, and the power of hope.